Hello and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 360th New Social Environment. I am Nick Bennett, the Special Projects Editor here at the Rail, and I have the pleasure and privilege of being your MC today for a conversation celebrating the legacy of Sister Corita Kent, and to welcome our guests, artists Jeffrey Gibson and Carrie Moyer, with Rail Editor-at-Large Dan Cameron. We are thrilled to have the poet Ama Birch here, who will read to close today's program. Just a few quick notes before we get started. The Rail team will be helping out with tech if you have any questions. Closed captions are available by pressing the live transcript button at the bottom of the screen. We started all of our events with two important acknowledgements. The first is that here in New York, we are on Lenapehoking, the unceded land and waters of the Wappinger, Canarsie, Munsee, and Lenni Lenape people of the Delaware Nation and Shinnecock Indian Nation. The second is an acknowledgement that Black Lives Matter. The heart of both of these acknowledgements is a commitment to the liberation of the oppressed and solidarity for all who struggle for freedom, in recognition that when it comes to liberation, our histories never unfold in isolation, as spoken by the great Angela Davis. In that spirit, I encourage you all to check the chat for a living document of resources and actions that will be posted in just a moment. But now to introduce today's guests and host. Multimedia artist Jeffrey Gibson synthesizes the cultural and artistic traditions of his Cherokee and Choctaw heritage with the visual languages of modernism and themes from contemporary popular and queer culture. In 2019, he was awarded a MacArthur Foundation Fellowship. Artist Carrie Moyer explores and extends the legacy of American abstraction while paying homage to many of its seminal female figures. And rife with visual precedents, Moyer's compositions reference color field, pop art, 1970s feminist art, among many other references. Our host today, curator, art writer, and educator Dan Cameron, served as the senior curator at the museum for 11 years and is the founding director of Prospect New Orleans, which assists in the cultural rebuilding of the city after Hurricane Katrina. He is an editor-at-large for the Brooklyn Rail. These are abridged bios. I'll be posting a link to full bios in the chat. And before passing it over, I also just want to thank Nellie Scott, the director of the Corita Art Center in Los Angeles, and Alex Fitzgerald at Andrew Krebs Gallery, who were both very helpful in making today's event possible. So thank you to everyone, and passing the mic over to you, Dan.
Thank you so much, Nick. Happy Tuesday, everybody. I am really delighted to be part of this, and I was honored when Nick reached out to me. I confess that I am someone who knew about Corita Kent and her art really all of my life. But it wasn't really, I think, until the last several years that I sort of started to be more aware of the influence of her work. And I think that this is a tricky question, is how one generation's work comes to influence another one. And Julie Alt, who's a very distinguished writer and educator herself, I think was really key in many ways, partly in her role as a founding member of Group Material, and later sort of thinking about alternative spaces and methods of showing art in New York City. I think she was maybe the person who sort of positioned Corita Kent's work as being on the cusp or on the vanguard of a way of thinking about art in relationship to society in the United States that I hadn't really considered at that time. And I guess because her work is not yet everywhere in the way that so many of her generation is, one tends to forget about these arguments. And then it was really the current show at Krebs Gallery that I think has caused people to sit up again and say, well, where does this work fit in? Not in terms just of the history at the time that it was made, but how does it fit in today in terms of what artists are grappling with? And so I was thinking a little bit about Corita Kent's life. And before get into that, I should mention that although she was a nun in the Immaculate Heart Convent for more than 30 years, she did lose the title sister when she left the order. And the circumstances under her about her leaving the order are not really something we need to dwell on. But I did want to note that while she was still active, the LA Archdiocese described her as communist and her work as blasphemous. And so if there is a conflict about the title sister in terms of her mission, her spiritual mission, in terms of the Catholic Church, I would say that's maybe one of the places to look for that. But backing up a little bit, she taught art for 3 decades, and she taught art to some pretty important people who all ended up crediting her for sort of giving them direction in their life. Among those people are Alfred Hitchcock and John Cage and Buckminster Fuller and Ray and Charles Eames. And so there's this part of who Corita Kent is that is not about her or her particular vision, but about her role as a teacher, how she explored painting, which was really her specialty in the classroom, although she has a master's in art history. The way she discussed painting and the way she discussed history, I think really inspired these truly gigantic figures that then went on to inspire all of us. But really, it's when she chose her preferred medium, lithography, silk screening, which really, thanks to Warhol, had become sort of pushed back into the fine arts realm at the time that she was working. That gave her a lot of freedom, and that freedom allowed her to explore many themes simultaneously, and she produced a rich and abundant body of work in the medium of surgery without actually, I think, how can I say it, impacting the world outside of the printmaking world for some time. I think that this impact is sort of delayed. So what the Krebs show is allowing us to do is go back to this particular body of work called Heroes and Sheroes, and they're showing it for the first time in New York in its entirety. And it's a very powerful experience. I found myself having to sort of go through it multiple times just to sort of fit it all together. And I think maybe this is the best time, if you would, Nick, to share some of these images for people who both have seen it and haven't. And I would invite, Jeff and Carrie, if they wanted to sort of chime in a little bit on some of these images. So this is an installation of you. The first several images just simply show, how the work is laid out. We don't have to sort of really linger over all of these. I think that the presentation here, for example, shows how much variety and diversity of composition and color there is within a pretty intentionally limited framework. These works were, I think, sort of tucked away into a category of quote unquote protest art at the time. And I think that's often how the work has been treated. But in fact, when you look at them now, the formal qualities of each image and the way she sort of plays with all of the different elements are just remarkable. I mean, they're pictorially developed in every sense of the word. And to me, that's a little bit of I don't know, it's a little startling, almost a slap in the face to sort of say, wow, these works hold up over time so much better than so many other things that were made at the time.
I mean, I feel like she's a direct inheritor of someone like Paul Rand, who was such an important modernist designer from the 40s and 50s onward. I mean, these are, I think one of the reasons they're so sort of graphically satisfying is because they engage in that language, but they're using really intense colors that were unseen, were not part of graphic language before the 60s, and using methods of photography that were not used before either. So, but I just to go back to something that Dan said, I mean, I know a lot of people who had Corita's posters up in their homes. So I think, you know, for those in the know in the 60s and 70s, these were very prized items for people to have around and beloved.
Would you include yourself in that group, Carrie? I mean, you had works by Corita on the
Really,
wall.
just to sort of introduce my own relationship to her, I said this earlier to everyone before the audience came in. I didn't really know, the first introduction to Corita was when the Love Stamp came out in the, I believe it was in the 80s. And by then I was a
85.
narcissistic, you know, punk rocker. And I was like, ugh, what is this? And then as I sort of learned more about her legacy and the history of the work she had done, it feels really baked into the visual culture of the period that I grew up in, which is the 60s and 70s. So.
Well, she was clearly inspired by the civil rights movement. She was clearly inspired by the anti-Vietnam War movement. I mean, I think these were at the forefront of what she was doing. And it seems to me that there's also a kind of an egolessness to her art. You know, she talked a lot about Warhol and how, you know, in '62, you know, Warhol's fusion of consumerism, you know, and high art really inspired her. She thought pop was fantastic. She thought it was a way to open the doors, but she took it in another direction. She combined this sort of consumerist language with a quest for spiritual articulation, you know, talking about the spiritual life
Well, I
in terms of these images. Sorry,
No,
Carrie.
I didn't mean to interrupt. I think the thing that's so fabulous about her was that she was much more directly political than any of the pop artists were. That was, you know, this feeling of ambiguity that is embedded in pop art is not seen here. We know exactly, you know, where she stands on these things and who these people are.
Mm-hmm.
And it sort of partakes of this other language around recognizing leaders in certain movements. I mean, we don't have that so much today. We have it a little bit, but you know, all of these people were very recognizable at the time. Daniel Berrigan, you know, all the Catholic priests who were against the war. So I had to look up some of who these people were. I went on the Corita, the center's website, which has a really thorough archive and it's really beautifully designed. So anyone wanting to know more knowledge should check that out.
But at what point, Carrie, since we're kind of on the topic, when did your relationship to the work intensify and become deeper and richer?
I think I had a period in my work where I did a lot of political posters myself for the queer and lesbian activism in the 90s and the Avengers and Dyke Action Machine. And then wanting to sort of bring some of that sentiment into painting and thinking about my own history, which was that I sort of grew up around all these the sense of the sense of society being in crisis, and what the visuals that accompanied that. So I started doing a lot of research in the 2000s and late 90s about was the graphic language of this period that encompassed my childhood. So I was looking at like Atelier Populaire and May 68 images, a lot of Polish design. So that was a kind of source material for my own painting.
So sorry.
It's okay.
That was me. We were warned.
Yeah, so it was a source for painting and thinking about, you know, could this language show up in painting? And if it did, what would it look like? Would it be a method of history painting? Would it be I was interested in something I was calling like poster space, which was a kind of weird extension from high modernism in that the notion of anti-illusionistic space, like if you look at any of these graphic or any of these screen prints of Corita's, they're very frontal, right?
Mm-hmm.
Everything is sort of demarcated in this really like engaging and sort of aggressive way, but beautiful because of the color and the composition.
And in terms of your work now, you don't seem any less connected over time. It almost seems like your relationship to work just becomes richer.
Yeah, I think she's, maybe Jeff will talk about this too. It's like you have these people who get sort of buried in your consciousness, and you're still working with them as kind of like intellectual or formal or aesthetic material. Like Frankenthaler is another person for me. But you're not sort of conscious of it. It's like, how do these, they become a kind of bedrock for how your practice grows. And, the thing I love about Corita is that this is like very populist work. It's not meant to be, even though there's a lot of text on it, it's not meant to be hard to understand or obscure, right? It's using all these really direct images and language.
Jeff, since you were name dropped just now, I was wondering if maybe you could speak a little bit about your initial engagement with Corita Kent, because I know she's been a growing influence on your work over the last few years.
Oh, I mean, since the minute I learned about her, she's someone who I've paid attention to and I feel like just learned from. But as I said before the audience came on, Carrie was actually the first person to introduce Corita to me. And now I'm hearing it was at the time that she was kind of like really diving in deep at this whole period in the early 2000s, because we met in 2003.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember it really clearly in a car in Newark, and it was cold. And I think maybe somebody was giving me a ride back to Brooklyn, and Carrie was like really excited about talking about her painting, and she had a show coming up, I think called Chromafesto or Chromafesta maybe.
Yeah, wow. You have an amazing memory, Jeff.
Well, I don't remember a lot of things, I'll put it that way, but this I remember. And I just remember, like, the story of Corita, being a nun and an artist and the pop references. It's just sort of, has all of the elements of something worth paying attention to. And then, so I remember looking it up, and I think also because maybe like Carrie at a different stage, I'm a painter. I've done many other things, but I really identify as a painter. And I think that painting holds so many possibilities within narrative, or even just sort of different kinds of narrative, suggestions of narrative within civility, justice, and politics. And yeah, I think I was in a similar struggle. Like, how can these things come together so that we have both a good painting and we have the content that I was hoping to find in my peers and in art being made. And I think, Corita, it's interesting because her work, I feel like different pieces operate differently at different times. Like, I know that I started collecting her work probably back in 2009. I think I got my first print. And I was really focused on that really brightly colored work that I think, like Carrie was saying, it's not as direct as the Heroes and Sheroes work. It's in there, but looking at these, when I was asked to sit on today's talk, they're so present in terms of, in particular, like the past like 2 years, 3 years that we've come through, and I hadn't looked at them that way. I did a show with Robert's Projects that was meant to happen in 2020, and the work was really focused on gender pronoun usage. And I mean, there's very few artists that I think refer to specifically with text, but I would say two of the top ones would be Corita and also Edgar Hepburn. And a lot of it has to do with the kind of brevity of the weight of the language that they use. So it's not like it hits you like a ton of bricks. It kind of like whacks you over the head like a heavy pillow. You know, they don't knock you down. They just sort of like take the wind out of you for a minute when they're really direct. And they seem so pointed, but in fact they can still be interpreted in many different directions that I think are about a form of projection, right? And it always makes me think that like when I look at something, whatever I think I'm looking at is actually about me. Like it's actually about who I am in the world, and that kind of self-reflexive quality. Her work, when I look at it and interpret it for myself, makes me responsible for what I see in the work. And I think that's a really powerful thing when we find it, especially in graphics, because I think in graphics it works very well, you know. But yeah, that's really how I kind of came into it. And I visited the Corita Art Center a few times, and I was always impressed with how humble it is. I don't know what it's like now, I haven't been in a few years, but the humbleness of looking at her work, looking at a PDF and them pulling them out on these tables, and it just kind of continued, I think, her legacy in the way that I imagined it.
I think this, the point of who am I in the world, you know, how do I seek my identity or build on my identity through, you know, exposure to other people's artistic visions. I think that's a really, you know, central kind of question that so many artists are facing today. And I think that, you know, I would have to go back to the religious vocation that Corita had, because in that case, to use Carrie's phrasing, there is no ambiguity. It's really very clear what a nun what a nun's mission in the world is, and it's to share love and to, you know, share these values of understanding of other people, and I think of selflessness, where you take the emphasis off yourself as the vehicle, and simply say it's the content of the work that matters. It's what's most important is that everyone sees themselves in this work and find a message that they can take away.
I think also she's very passionate, which is, you know, I mean, she's often sort of lumped with pop art, but her whole yeah, to follow up on what Dan is saying, it's like everything is filled with feeling, you know, even when you're looking at like Warhol's electric chair paintings, you're like, is he getting some sort of gruesome jollies out of screening this image? Although, you know, supposedly it was from a political point of view. I mean, I feel like when she's creating these images, especially of her four heroes, Christ, RFK, JFK, and Martin Luther King, you know, she's taken this sort of vernacular image that one would see in many homes, these sort of portraits that were very popular in the 60s of these different leaders, and turned them into a kind of joyous, much less solemn image, right?
Well, I think she is still. Oh, go ahead. Sorry, I didn't.
I'm bringing this into a sort of arena of like youth culture, which is different than a portrait of JFK that might be in your living room, you know.
And I think that may be one of the things that I think has caused a delay in our overall embrace of Corita within the art world, because there was no point that she switched over to paintings. She didn't say, well, you know, I'm going to start making unique objects that are more valuable because they were hand painted by the artist. And, you know, the path that Warhol took was the sort of standard. It was in many ways the gold standard of how you go from popular imagery to museum scale art. And I think the topicality of the work was one of the things that scared people away. The feeling that, well, the Vietnam War will end, someday we will put these assassinations behind us. Even maybe speciously thinking someday the civil rights movement will have achieved all of its goals. All of these things I think were in the air, and not people, but I think artists sort of in the post-Warhol era didn't really want to get tied to subject matter that they felt would fade over time. And as we're seeing today, half a century after these works were made, in fact, the opposite has happened. These images become more resonant over time, and I think that's there's a powerful message for us in that.
I think, just especially this one, I think it's so kind of fantastic. But it does make you have this kind of visceral feeling about what it feels like to be in a country in crisis, which is how I've experienced the last 3 to 4 years, especially last year. And so it's like everything feels undone. And so, just sort of watching, as I went through all these images this morning, watching this parade of people that were lost. And then, these very, at least for me, as someone who grew up in this era, like Cesar Chavez, it's like that person is so well known to me. I didn't eat grapes until I was like in my 20s, so it's just a very fascinating, like the fact that she really honed in on these very particular parts of each movement, I think is interesting. I don't know where the sheroes are. I guess that would be my question.
You mean where they're depicted in the series?
Yeah. Yes.
That's a very good question. But Jeff, could you actually maybe address this theme of topicality just for a moment before we return to that? Because I think that this sort of idea that these crises that are now 50 years old are still with us today says so much about, as Carrie was pointing out, the crises we've been going through over the last 4 years.
Mm-hmm. I was thinking, sort of like if Corita was still alive and making work today, how would she be responding to the world that we're in now? Because I think, she I feel like these prints and her larger body of work, they're also very kind of specific to the time that she was making work. And I think that her language, both in terms of, the graphic language, the use of color, her formal decisions in image making, they're really good. And they kind of keep expanding like how good they are. I know for me, I almost separate them on some level between thinking about how she addressed a topic in the time that she was living in, being who she was. One of the things that comes to mind is obviously this was risky for her to make in terms of a huge commitment that she made in her life as a nun, and then leaving, or being asked to leave. And that, I remember I've had so many thoughts in my head over the past decade about this, but just how kind of crushing I imagine that would have been for someone who committed to something like being a nun. And I think also the fact that her work really emerged out of outside the art world more than aspirations of becoming an artist. And I think that there's some sort of crossover between the aspirations of, to put it really simply, being a good person, sort of usurped in this kind of popular notion of pop art. And not that she wasn't making decisions in that way, but I think it's I always read it as this kind of community building kind of celebration of pop culture, that there was a larger audience that needed to hear these perspectives and these words. And so, and then I think about, in terms of myself, in a similar way, I'm like, so here you are, you live in this world, you're a native queer man. Like, so my topics are, they might overlap, but there's also differences, and so, um, example I can think of is, and I don't think we have an image of this, but is a piece that uses the lyrics of Helen Reddy, and it says, "In numbers too big to ignore," and that is a phrase that I've used to kind of address everything from missing and murdered Indigenous women to simply Native populations around the world to queer Indigenous people and youth, and just this idea of kind of those underrepresented kind of collective populations that I think are oftentimes dismissed and disempowered because of that. So I think for me, she's kind of given me this like structure that is a sort of, it's a dynamic between content and visual language that I can still sort of almost drop my own content into, and even kind of reapply works that she's made. We're going back 50 years at this point, and reapply them to sort of like what we're going through today. And I still think it's very powerful what she's doing. I mean, the term black is, the words black is beautiful here and redemption, I mean, they will continue to mean things going into the future. They don't lose their meaning. The content of them and the context of them shift somewhat independently, and they're still in conversation with each other. And I think that's what, for me, also her use of like highlighting words in different colors and sort of how those words, the red on the hot pink sort of submerges much more than the blue does. Oftentimes she'll put biblical text in a color that you can barely read against the background color, and you've really got to like, I've photographed it and blown it up just so I can read it. So this one, the assassination one, is brilliant. I mean, just this kind of, and it almost seems intuitive and impulsive, whether that's true or not, I have no idea. It's just the way that I read it, that this sort of like, oh, I can see I can see I can see Viola, I can see nation. And that another phrase that I used is from Gladys Knight and the Pips, and it's, I've got to use my imagination to think of good reasons to keep on keeping on. Mm-hmm. And using color, and this is totally a Corita credit, I shifted it to read "To my nation, keep on, to my nation, think of good reasons to keep on keeping on." And so it was just that sort of thing that I've learned from her about, I guess it's just formal decision making and finding a way to make it impactful in terms of message making.
Carrie used the word populist, which I really like. I think it's a very, it's kind of key to understanding the work. But I think of the populism in a way as directly connected to her spiritual vocation. In that, in the same way, and I, at the risk of repeating myself, in the same way that Warhol wanted to elevate the banal to the status of fine art, I think what Corita's work is doing is saying, like, what appears to be banal, what appears to be everyday, is in fact something holy. That this everydayness, this plainness, this unpretentiousness of it is in fact a reflection of the fact that every aspect of our lives is something that are spiritually significant, and part of the role of the artist, I would argue, in society, is to sort of hold up a mirror to viewers to sort of say, this isn't just about this object or the artist, this is also about you and your life. And I think that's incredibly important right now. I think that's why her work comes through with such crystal clarity, I want to say.
Well, some of her I think they're earlier, probably Nellie or Alex can correct me. The Wonder Bread packages, the stuff that says General Mills, I think. I mean, I feel like I would agree with you. I feel like she's she's almost embodying the Oldenburg art is, this thing about like, art is like whatever you find when you walk out on the street, the stinky shoes, the garbage can, the package of Wonder Bread. Of course, bread has a very specific connotation in Catholicism, but so even using that word wonder and pulling that word wonder out and relating it to something that is consumerist, would be framed as consumerist in the language of sort of male pop artists, but it takes on this whole other meaning. It's more about like finding joy in a kind of everydayness. But I also think there are like this poster on the left, the flag, this tension between being part of a group and being an individual, where in this one that's about assassination and America and violence, the eye keeps sticking out, like this message about a sort of unhealthy focus on individuality that's so American. I think it's she's got all these things they're deceptively simple, but they're really not.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot going on in them.
I think also just the fact that when I talk to people who bought work at this time or who acquired work and it was gifted to them, they, maybe a family member went to one of the workshops, they found it in flea markets, but the cost being so affordable to those people allowed them to I met somebody who said that they had bought like 10 or 12 of them and just glued them all together into one large mural. So there's not this preciousness that you spent thousands on something that you couldn't use it somehow. You couldn't, and maybe that meant like taping it to the wall, pinning it to the wall. But I think it didn't become an art object right away in many people's lives. And in the way that I think posters can function. Popular, mass-produced posters, and I think that that's really, really amazing. I mean, usually, when you're looking at Coritas, in my experience, there's oftentimes some evidence of handling of them. Whether it's like a fingerprint or a bend in the corner, or but they haven't always been treated as these precious objects.
And I think we could maybe extend it a little further and say that the fact that they haven't been treated as precious objects doesn't negatively impact their value, even a little bit. And I think that's remarkable.
Yeah.
And Jeffrey, in your current show, you don't, it's not Helen Reddy and Diana Ross. You actually have Corita Kent's own words in your recent show at Roberts. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. Like I said, the show started, I started like planning for the show probably back in like 2018. And it's funny too, because my previous show was also titled after a Corita work, and it was titled In Such Times, Clowns Become Witnesses. And that was actually just as the initial, Trump was running for president. And I think people were thinking that I was using the word clown to refer to Trump. But when I look at how I think Corita is really using the role of the clown, like in many Indigenous communities, the clown is the all-seer. The clown is somebody who nobody suspects is like thinking intellectually or critically. So therefore they kind of behave badly in front of them. They speak truth in front of them, and they don't realize that the clown is really the one who can actually observe and watch and record everything. So in many ways, I actually saw more myself as the clown, or as, the role of an artist as the clown. This piece here, so maybe the one on the right here, I could be someone, and all of this kind of couples in, obviously I work with a lot of like song lyrics. The title of this show was It Can Be Said of Them. And I was thinking about the use of gender pronouns. And even when I was thinking about this, I thought, I wonder, when I look at Corita's work, I oftentimes think that she is playing a lot with gender pronouns in her work. And maybe, I don't know to what end, but even just the term I, focusing on the individual, I've always just kind of wondered, I'm like, how was she playing with those pronouns? So I think I oftentimes try to remove the gender out of some things. So I could be someone is a similar thing. It's not a he or a she or a they, it's an I. The same thing with someone. And so to leave these kind of identifying factors as open-ended as I could. Like I said, the title of the show, It Can Be Said of Them. Oftentimes I often think also about the relationship between the individual and the collective. And in my mind, and I've never credited this to Corita, so I don't know if that's really how I feel, but in my mind, they're not actually counter to each other. You can have strong individualism within a collective, and sometimes hopefully greater than the sum of its parts if those individuals are engaged contributing members of a community. So it's not just a sort of like ego-driven individualism. And then can we go to another piece, Nick? So we go back to the, sorry, if we go to selected work, so they could choose, like you could go with they choose their family. So this one, so the same thing. I was just really playing with gender and being a parent of an adopted family. I think this is a phrase that comes around in different queer communities in particular, whether it's friends who become family or built families, extended families. The idea of choosing their family is something that I was just kind of like riffing off of It Can Be Said of Them and playing around with them, and then replacing he's with she and they's. And Nick, if we can go back to images just to the left here to the punching bag, yes we can. And this one, usually I think like yes we can, and then what it says in the yellow text on the top of the beadwork here is it says they, she, he, no, can, they, she, he, and then it says, yes, we can. And again, I think I like that kind of like blunt seeming simplicity of things when it's using text. And I almost like want to step back and be like, oh, Jeff, you have to do something more complicated than this. And then I'll look at a Corita work and I'll be like, oh, no, you want this kind of, what feels like a kind of, I don't mean shallow in terms of its integrity. I just mean like it's not like asking too much of a viewer to kind of like access this. And oftentimes that's sort of a good place for me to kind of stop. I feel like if it's like getting all the content that I want across, yeah, I feel pretty good about it. Yeah, and then it kind of moved into different music of the time period. And it's usually when I do a show and I'm developing a body of work, it really kind of has a starting point and then moves forward from there. The bottom left image here is the wall hanging that says It Can Be Said of Them. And this was the title piece for the show.
That's beautiful.
Thank you.
And so in many ways, because the reference to Corita isn't right out in the open, I think that's also giving the viewer the opportunity to discover and explore on their own terms, rather than having sort of the artist point the way, saying, this is what you should pay attention to.
Yeah, I think in many ways, I think, the role of artist offers many people like room to really like, be your worst individual self. And so I think Corita's work kind of, because it's so impactful on me, it kind of reminds me, it's like, oh, you don't need to do that. You can kind of make space. That's how I think about oftentimes about work, is it's sort of like, how do you make space for the viewer to be able to kind of like sit with it? And if they're there with it for 30 seconds, what can they walk away with? And if they're there with it for 2 hours, what can they walk away with it, from it? And so I feel kind of committed that there is depth as far as somebody's willing to go, but I don't want to make it complicated or difficult. And I want to make it really kind of upfront,
I think that something you said about gender is really striking to me, in that her her choice of pronouns were not intended to exclude anyone. They were all inclusive. And I think it gets back to, pardon me, what Carrie was saying about heroes and sheroes, and where are the sheroes? And I wonder if by creating that binary, saying not just heroes and sheroes, she's constructing a new word. She's introducing a new word into the English language in practice. And I think that doubling, that idea of expanding the notion of gender, wasn't necessarily intended to say, like, well, go look for the sheroes in my work, to match the heroes that are obviously depicted there. It's more, please think of heroes and sheroes together. Think of this as sort of, to use the theological construct, that we are all of one body, and that we are together in this. And so that someone who is female, or someone who is non-binary in terms of their gender, they will be part of this. They'll feel embraced. They'll feel that they're not left out.
I mean, it's interesting to think about. Sorry, go ahead, Carrie.
No, I don't know anything about this, so I would welcome Nellie's comment. I think, she was a nun in the 60s. There are, she's not really talking about feminism or anything like that. That sort of context doesn't come up. She, as someone wrote in the chat, Corita, Martin Luther King's wife, is in, why am I blanking on her name? Her name was Corita too, right?
Coretta.
Sorry.
No, but it's the same name.
Having a memory blank. I just wonder what the constraints of being a nun are on your relationship to power dynamics and all that, and how that gets channeled into the work. So I don't know. I don't see this work as, I see it as being interested in liberation in a sort of broad sense, but I don't see it as specifically acknowledging everything that was going on at that time in terms of different movements and stuff. And why should it? She was working with, different populations. I'm not saying that, I'm just noticing. I don't mean it to be a kind of expectation of the work.
Mm-hmm. That's why I think it's so interesting to think if she were alive and making work today, with the things that are topical today. And especially in terms of celebration of body, or of, for lack of a better word, like a body created by God.
Right.
Meaning without imperfection. It would just be so wild to me to if that trajectory of her, what we could imagine would be her thinking would have continued.
I want to just throw out here, because somebody mentioned it a bit earlier in the chat, that we do talk about Corita as being a nun during the 60s, but I think it's helpful to remember that she was a nun in the 30s, and that she started her teaching, the teaching part of her vocation, during the Great Depression. And so for probably 3/4 of her career as an artist, her output consisted of religious work. These were non-ambiguous, not necessarily modernist, not necessarily quote unquote sophisticated or cosmopolitan. These were images that were directly derived from the liturgy, and that were about kind of creating a contemporary visual glue for the sacrament of Mass, for all practicing Catholics to come together. And I think it could be fairly argued that the change that happened in her work, which is a pretty dramatic one, happened because the times that beginning in the late 50s and moving into the 60s, I think it was pretty apparent to anyone with a pulse that society was beginning to collapse in on itself, and that a different kind of voice, a different attitude and philosophy was needed.
Yeah.
I mean, I might be overstating that, but that's sort of what it feels to me, because when we become aware of her, it's really at exactly the same time that everyone in American intellectual life is saying, wow, it looks like the American dream might have just run off the rails.
I mean, something that's interesting that maybe Nellie could also speak on is that she actually was kind of discouraged from making the religious works, or that, you know, that they kind of the representations of you know, of the religious themes that were in those were also not approved of. So that was kind of like also responsible for, you know, her shifting away from directly depicting these religious stories in her work.
So there was something about her approach to religious content that
Mm.
also
Yeah.
was considered blasphemous.
Mhm.
Wow, go figure.
Yeah.
Carrie, you know, we're getting close to the Q&A part, and I was wondering if there was anything from your work that you would be interested in sharing to the people on the call.
Maybe Nick could pull up my very sad, not very well taken care of website. And
There we go.
just one of those, like, scroll up a little bit, like one of these in the middle here with the pink or the Morris Lewis quote. So I did a series of paintings that I called affiche, which is the French word for poster. And there was a movement of affichiste in this, I believe it was in the 50s. Dan would know better.
Paris.
In Paris. So I was thinking a lot about, you know, for me, I was thinking about Morris Lewis and what it would be like to actually do a sort of screen print of a pour. So in other words, a sort of dynamic, but going back and forth between printing and painting, and how those two, you know, printing, and Corita does this beautifully, and it's almost like a tenet of the work that printing is democratic, right? It's something, especially screen printing, it's a form that many people have access to. It's a form of political messaging that's very old, it thrives in many different cultures in Cuba and Mexico. And so how do, you know, the sort of framing of painting in high modernism and the fact that these two things were sort of happening simultaneously, you know, like screen printing coming from a kind of commercial end, and then this singularity of poured painting. Maybe you can show the next one. I don't know what it is, but. So I'm basically in these bodies of work sort of taking found images from graphics from that period and sort of slamming them together into these sort of austere compositions, and trying to either figure out a language of relationships, or, you know, set up some kind of dichotomous thing about looking. It's like, how do we read something versus how do we experience something viscerally? Like, these are, in this way, these are similar to my current work and all of my work, in that, you know, this pour in the center, one has to see it up close to get all the juiciness of it. So it's like setting up something very dry and seemingly intellectual and sort of legible versus something that is experiential. Maybe one more. Excuse me. And here, you know, even more directly in conversation with this group of people. Dan mentioned Buckminster Fuller early on. So sort of, again, setting up something where Kathleen's Monument to the Third International meets Buckminster Fuller meets. I had a little red book when I was about 12. Somebody gave it to me. And so I was really interested in sort of communist propaganda from an early age. So there's Lenin, Marx, and Mao. Mao is covered by the red pour, sort of buried inside of this figure. And at the time when I made this work, I would have people who were, 20 years older than me saying, what are you making fun of our youth? You know what I mean? So it's like, was me sort of trying to deal with ideas about utopia and politics and how they might fit into painting, because I grew up as someone, even though I went to school in the era of postmodernism, the idea of how content and messaging lived in painting is very relevant, continues to be relevant. So you can see Corita all over these, actually. So that's
No, it's like with raised fist in this piece.
Yeah. But this was a reference to Sisterhood is Powerful. The Robin Morgan book, the cover of the book had this fist on it. So, in the same way that she was drawing from very current things around her, from Newsweek to Life magazine, I was drawing from this very particular period of imagery that might resonate with people.
Before we move to the Q&A, just one last tangent I want to pursue. And, I think it's typical of our times that it took several minutes into this discussion for me to understand that we've got an all queer panel here. And I think the fact that it has not been commented on is beautiful in its own way. But speaking from my own experience, growing up, queer in a heteronormative patriarchy, results in one feeling like an outsider. And there are plenty of ways that one can feel like an outsider in society. But this is a really explicit experience that you're sort of standing outside of this structure that seems all powerful and all pervasive. And you're sort of pounding on the outside of it, or just standing there saying, what voice do I have? How do I enter? How do I find my way when I'm up against this sort of all-powerful structure? And I'm not saying that there was a queer side necessarily to Corita's work. I don't even have the tools to speculate on that. But what I will say is that it strikes me as remarkable that so many people who have lived a lot of their lives feeling like outsiders immediately identify with her position, with the way that she interacts. And I'm not just talking about the Catholic Church, I'm also talking about the hierarchies of the art world. Does that ring a bell for anyone?
I mean, I think she, I think she probably was an incredible teacher. It'd be great if there was somebody in the audience who was her student. I think that comes across in the work, right? It's like, it's very broad and sort of embracing. Yeah, I don't know that I feel this way because I'm a lesbian. I think it's just that I'm like I'm coming at it from the other end. It's like, I'm interested in something that sort of sees everybody. I don't know. Maybe that's what you just said, Dan, and I'm saying it in a more convoluted way.
I think in my mind, religion, the Bible, the teachings of the Bible are meant to embrace everybody and meant to not see the differences between us. And I think it's something that, a lot of people, maybe have heard me say this before, but both of my grandfathers were Southern Baptist ministers in the South. And, growing up, being aware of the relationship between Indigenous nations and the church, my first impulse was to reject the church and to the teachings of the Bible. But then, the way I was raised, sort of like half of the family practiced traditional Cherokee and Choctaw ceremony, and then the other half was involved in the church. And it was presented to me that the church was this structure, and really, like, when you look at the scripture, so much of it is about this embrace of everybody, and to be a good Christian in my case would be to not judge. You're not in the position to judge. You're in the position to engage. You're in the position to teach. You're in the position to do better. So I guess in that way, I guess I agree with both of you. Being a queer person, I think I totally have taken such inspiration from Corita and the language of someone who did exist, by the time I learned about them, existed in the art world proper, as extending an invitation to sort of be like, come, it's like, we're here for you.
Beautiful. I actually think that may be a good cue, and perhaps Nick to go on to start with the Q&A. How does that sound to everyone?
Great.
Great. I simply want to thank you all for being a part of this, and what wonderful insights. And I'm just so thrilled that we can share this with our audience, the wonderful work of Corita, and a little plug to make sure, if you are in New York, to see the show at Andrew Krepp's Gallery in its last few days on view. Before, I don't mean to put you on the spot, but maybe before we jump into Q&A, Nellie, if I could maybe hand you the mic, if there was anything you wanted to add to this.
Can you hear me? Am I okay? Okay, good. First, I just want to echo the thank you to all of you for such a thoughtful conversation. I get the pleasure of working and talking about Corita every day. I'm very lucky in that respect to be her champion. And I think so many wonderful questions I saw come up in the chat and thought starters. And the piece that you had up earlier, it's bright yellow, it's called A Passion for the Possible, is one that I have visited a lot in this last year and a half during quarantine, and everything else going on in this world. And I think that it sums up this series quite nicely, because it basically sums up a lot of Corita it's about the message. Often when she talks about herself in interviews, she introduces herself as an educator first, and it's very clear she's still teaching us. And in this piece, she, really talks about what hope means, and that it's not just optimism, it's hard work, and you have to show up every day to create change. And this could be my reflection, but what is my personal responsibility to the greater whole? And I think that really struck a chord this last year. And this series, and what it does so beautifully, and we're so lucky to have it displayed at the gallery at the moment. So please do visit if you're in New York. It's at a time when she had sought dispensation from her vows. So it just kind of, all of these things bubble up out of her, and she's very productive in 68 and 69, creating several series, and this is one of them. And Corita herself never marched. I think that's pretty important to know, but she saw her art as a tool for activism and her contribution to the larger whole. Printmaking is a very physical act. She was a very petite woman, and just sat there, printing and pulling the screen to get the message out. And I think often about, there's this quote that Dan Berrigan uses of like, know where you stand and stand there. And I think that when you think of the 60s works and what was happening in Vatican II is a really important context of how do you change the language in which you're reaching people, the way that they had changed Mass at that time. And further, just to touch on it, because I saw it come up around the context in which she was making work, and what was so special about this order in particular, they really took Vatican II to heart. Not just a little bit, but all the way. And when they left, because it's the larger order did leave in 1970, and created the Immaculate Heart Community, which still exists today, and that we're a project of. 40% of them had their master's or higher. These are very educated women who gave Corita the space and time to be able to create and push these boundaries with her work, and stood behind her. But she certainly was not alone. There was a community of women, forward thinkers on every level. There's, one of them had a record deal, or a group of them had a record deal. These are really incredible women that she was working with and inspired by, and working with her students too. So just to give a little context there of where I think the feminism comes in, of this idea of collective practice with her students and the order, and of course the message. And then Alex had brought up with the 50s works with the religious pieces. Corita was not working in a silo. That's the one thing I think I can definitely tell you. She was with Sister Mag, going across country, doing tours. She was very active within the scenes in New York and other artists. We have photographs of her in Rothko's studio at that time when she's also making these works. And yes, she did make a shift out of those kind of very direct figurative works to the text space because of this larger tension that was happening with the archdiocese around her work. And at one point they were very active in wanting to censor that, including putting people in her studio to oversee her work environment. So talk about working within a system to change a system at all times. So, okay. I'm happy to answer any other questions, but really just thank you. And we really appreciate everybody on this call.
Thank you so much, Nellie. Thank you for kind of highlighting that sort of radiant optimism, but reminding us, it takes hard work from many people. And kind of going back to what you said, Jeff, that there are strong individuals within a group and each sort of plays their part. So that's a wonderful takeaway from today. So one of many, but first I'm gonna pass the mic over to GE. GE, you should be able to turn on your mic now.
Yes, thank you so much, Nick, and thank you so much for this opportunity today. Corita has spoken to me over the decades since fourth grade, when the nuns of Sacred Heart Parish hung her posters all through our school. My question is, can anybody here, perhaps Nellie maybe specifically, address Kent's work in terms of Mae Stevens? Were they aware of each other's work? And also, I was thinking of something else I just add on entirely too, because they also worked in the words and text process with printing. The work of Brother Antonius, known as William Everson, the poet. So anyway, if anybody could address that, it'd be very appreciative. Thank you.
I'm happy to take that. I would just say never say never. They very much aware of what was happening with her contemporaries, and oftentimes in communication with, like any artist practicing today, you are aware of the other artists and the work that they're doing. And so I wouldn't be surprised, we're still learning more every day. It's kind of the 7 degrees of Corita. So I wouldn't be surprised if they were at least aware of.
Thank you.
Thank you, GE and Nellie. There have been a lot of wonderful insights and comments from Irene in the chat. So Irene, I'm going to pass you the mic. You should be able to turn on your microphone now.
Okay, and I guess I could put the camera, I don't know. I guess the camera doesn't matter.
Up to you.
I don't know
Totally
why
up to
it's
you.
not on. Oh, here we go. I was not prepared for being on camera today, but I'm so excited about this conversation. I'm so excited about the discovery of Corita by so many younger generations. I have written a play about Corita called Little Heart, which is going to premiere in Santa Cruz at the Jewel Theater, which is an equity house, next year, the 2022-2023 season. And Corita, I started seriously studying Corita in 2001 when I started interviewing students of hers because this play started taking shape in my mind. And one of the things that we haven't spoken about today is the incredible effort of female voices to reach the mainstream, especially in those days. And the fact that Corita was able to be on the cover of Newsweek and do massive advertising campaigns for huge companies, Westinghouse and so forth, who were all trying to amplify that spiritual voice that we hear in her work. I want Corita to only be a wonderful, benevolent spirit, and she had a feisty aspect to her, and working with the Archdiocese was a huge challenge. So there are many very dramatic aspects to her life. I think Nellie covered a number of them, but she continues to unfold for me as a fascinating character as well as a brilliant artist.
Can I ask
and
you?
I'm happy to answer anything.
Oh,
Yeah.
What did the Archdiocese think of her doing advertising? Actually, are you saying she was in advertisements, or she
eventually she eventually was commissioned by large IBM, for example, and other places. And early on, I mean, they did a huge Christmas display at IBM in New York City. And early on, they were very upset. The diocese was, of course, very upset by it. A lot of other people were upset by it. And Corita was like, it says peace on earth. Why are they making me take it down? I mean, there were kind of ridiculous responses from people. But the greater bulk of her work for advertising didn't happen until after she left the convent. She did things for George McGovern. She did, just remarkable things for many big companies. So, but that was after she left for the most part.
Wow, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, Mr. Schwartz is talking about the gas tank. One of the remarkable things about Corita is that she's known for creating one of the smallest artworks in the world, which is her love stamp, but also the largest single copyrighted artwork, which was the Boston gas tank. And if you just look that up, you will be quite astonished by the size of this artwork.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much, Irene. And
sure.
It's so heartening to see so many huge fans of Corita in the audience. I think for our final question, I'm going to it's sort of a comment, but on her behalf, thank you, Nancy, in the chat for sharing so much. Nancy shared that, I'm sorry, I have to find it now. She says that I do think nuns were the first feminists in Western history. And throwing that out there is an interesting comment. Any responses to that?
Yeah. I mean, I was not raised in a religious household, but I mean, I idealize nuns. My God. Yeah. Just think of all those nuns back to the Middle Ages who have been so important as like thinkers and on the forefront of the, speaking for women who didn't have a voice. So I would echo what Irene said.
Well, thank you. And also, yeah, back to the gas tank, Eileen Miles in the audience said that we lived and died for that tank. Those of us who grew up in Boston, none did that. So, so thank you, nuns. Well, I want to thank you all again so much for joining us today and for all of your insights. But here at the Rail, we do have a tradition of closing our community events with the poetry reading. Today, I am thrilled to welcome our poet laureate, Ama Birch, to the stage. Poet Ama Birch is the author of 3 books, Faces in the Clouds, Sonnet Boom, and the Ferguson Interview Project, as well as a video game available for Android, Spacequake by Ama Birch. She holds a Master of Fine Arts in Creative Writing from the California Institute of the Arts. And without further ado, Ama, the stage is yours.
All right. Can you hear me all right?
Perfectly.
Perfect.
All right, great. This has been really profound. Corita's work is silkscreen. I mean, the fact she's working with Gutenberg's printing press and utilizing the same tools as the Bible. To me, I just find it so profound what she's trying to communicate with us all. Thanks, Brooklyn Rail, for inviting me. I'm currently on Mashpee Lenape land, and these people are called the people of the first light. And I just wanted to take a moment to acknowledge that. I also want to advertise a reading I have in real life at Pioneer Works on Friday the 13th of August at 8 p.m. with Matthew Shipp's trio and David Henderson.
Wow.
We're celebrating Alex Harsley's work, the great photographer. The doors open at 7 p.m. Now for some poetry. AB 020577 is the name of this poem. Sallow night, worms magnified with moonlight. Sammy, are you here? A plate falls. Don't know why I didn't come. Pulled the espresso shot. Drenched the pool of light from the moon. How? That was unnecessary. I am not the wolf. I am more like a slimy eel these days. Let me pull you closer to me. The chest is full of gold. Children going home from school, dancing, crossing streets, staying with you for all time. Who can say, when will the cookie come back? You don't know what the nights are like, missing the perfect laugh in secret. Oh, put some ice in it. Sing out loud and go to the moon. The light sings a beautiful song. Francis is here. What a saint. Play that music. Swing, swing, swing in spring, lost and insecure corn muffin. Hold on to me. Slurp. Can I enjoy a drink? Another day with ketchup on the counter. Wind swept off feet. Enter the Milky Way. Did you find yourself? Heroes bleed. Would you like some more hot water? First, break all the rules. Does it feel like home? What's mine is yours. Crumple the paper, shake the plastic bag, Gregorian chant, fade into overtones, eat more whipped cream, rule the world, come back. Yes, yes, cough, cough, puppet on a chain, hand me a napkin, stand by me, the smell of coffee. Can I get the deluxe? Can I be a star? Open the gates, flood the oranges, cry with the raw meat. No one knows my name.
Beautiful.
So that was published in 2019 in the Brooklyn Rail. And I had this poem published in the June Brooklyn Rail this year. It's called The Big Fake, Gentrification on the Hudson, Public Art or Public Fart. Artist on a boat, George Washington crossing the Delaware, spirit trumpets blow, 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 Matta Clark, Hammond's approaches, The skeleton of empty cathedral echoes old New York. Let me walk on water. Step right up, folks. There's nothing to see. It's Jersey. It's for the birds. Hudson quakes. Boats with lights pass, 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 pass. Hudson freezes around day's end. Flash back to another time. Cruising men, prostitutes, and drugs sail next to cathedral at Pier 52. Light breaks through, holes cut, striking water below. Looking through, my eyes are here for the show. Birds soar, light strikes from above. I wrote this poem for a woman I work with, this next poem, for a woman I work with who asked me to write a poem for the essential workers of the Hudson Valley. It's called Lifesavers. Driving down Albany Post Road en route to work near Beekman Arms, I am struck in ringing bells of river calling me home, agony of birth and death. The essential worker is there, children of farmers, a cow's bell, raising the spirits, elderly feel love, remember Sapasco, remember tribe, counterpoint, symphony of Jupiter, conversations within dialogues, a glance with smiling eyes. I ride the waves towards the sexton, saltwater and Tiffany. My bed is a raft, my life in an estuary. And the last poem I'm gonna read is called The Bird Trade. Wild turkeys, road runners, owls fly, bobcat on the prowl, coyote peers through, fence, a teenager ties their shoes, a person takes out the trash. They are digging a hole, driver, 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 deeper, deeper, deep, dig, 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 fence goes up, gates close, thirsty on the border, separated family, mi familia, spirit keeps soaring, we will find a path. Before the wall, we moved in spring, when the heat of the desert was at its least, before the trip was certain death, certain failure, certain disaster, the curtain falls, cages enter, teenagers in cages, families separated at the border, a path, they need a path, they're off the path. The root of the problem, the department store. We still need farm labor. We still need the spirit of Cesar Chavez. There are carcass on the road, turkey vultures, radio towers, ruined, boats enter through Falcon Dam Port, red snapper fly, gulp, 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 blue water totality, swimming with tropical fish, take a dip, be baptized, save your soul, time to go home. Wild hair, tell the mountain lion to try again in the future. A sea of fists in the air. Jericho was here, Kilroy was here too. Tumbleweed, tumbleweed, tumbleweed. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ama. It's a pleasure to read your poetry, but an even greater pleasure to hear you read your poetry. So
You're here.
thank you so much for joining us today and so perfectly concluding this event. Before we do go though, I want to pass the mic back to Carrie for something else to share.
Oh, thank you, Nick. I just realized that, or remembered that I have a show up with my wife, the sculptor Sheila Pepe, which is very much in the spirit of Corita. It's called Tabernacles for Trying Times, and it's at the Museum of Art and Design at Columbus Circle, and it's be up through the winter. So check it out. We're gonna have a lot of interesting programming, and I stuck the link in the chat. Thank you so much for inviting me to do this.
Well, thank you, Carrie. We put the link back. I put it in there too. So just to be doubly sure, everyone check out that exhibition. And Ama, I also, for Ama's upcoming reading, I put a link in the chat for people to check out, to buy tickets. One last time, I want to thank, of course, Carrie, Jeffrey, and Dan. Thank you, Alex and Andrew Krebs Gallery. And for our friends on the West Coast, be sure to check out the Corita Art Center in Los Angeles. And thank you, Nellie. We do this conversation series every day at 1 p.m. So join us tomorrow for our radical poetry reading with Joy Priest, featuring poets Kibenga Adesina, Sanam Sharif, Bernardo Wade, and Taylor Bias. You now can all turn on your mics and say Happy Tuesday.
Happy Tuesday.
Happy Tuesday.
Happy Tuesday. Thank you, one and all.
Thank you.
Tuesday.
Bye-bye.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thanks, everyone.
Happy
Thank
Tuesday.
you.
Thank you.
Happy Tuesday.
Thanks,
Thanks,
everyone.
Eileen.
Thank you.